I walked into that showroom like I owned it. Because I did. The Meridian Design Showcase space on Michigan Avenue, sleek, cold, smelling like new leather and expensive ambition. I'd leased it 3 months earlier for our spring collection preview. My name was on the contract. My company's credit line was attached to the account. Every fixture, every curated piece in that space existed because I had approved it. So when the showroom manager, a quiet, precise woman named Helen, met me at the front entrance with her hands folded too tightly in front of her and her eyes doing this thing, this careful, deliberate thing where she wasn't quite looking at me, I noticed. I noticed because I notice everything. It's what made me good at my job. It's what I thought made me a good partner. A good fiancé. I was wrong about the second part. Helen said, "Miss Carter. I'm glad you came in early." And then she paused. Just a half-second too long. I said, "Is there a problem with the inventory staging?" She said, "Would you come with me, please?" Not an answer. A redirect. And something in my chest went very, very still. She walked me through the main floor, past the furniture installations, past the lighting displays, past a rack of fabric samples I'd personally sourced from a supplier in Milan. And she took me into the back, past the storage corridor, through a door I'd never needed to use before, into the small security office where the building's surveillance system fed into 4 monitors stacked on a metal desk. The guard on duty stood up when I walked in. He looked at Helen. Helen nodded at him. He pressed play. And there, on the center monitor, in the grainy but perfectly legible timestamp footage from 2 days earlier, I saw Adrian. My Adrian. Standing in my showroom. With Lila. My Lila. My business partner, my protégé, the woman I'd mentored through 3 years of building this company from a single contract job into a firm with a reputation that commanded rooms. They weren't looking at samples. They weren't discussing staging. They were standing at the front consultation desk, the one I used to meet with high-end clients, and Lila had her laptop open, and Adrian was leaning over her shoulder, and they were both looking at something on the screen, and they were laughing. Not the polite laugh of colleagues. The comfortable, private laugh of people who believe they're completely alone. Then the timestamp jumped. New angle. The back office of the showroom, also my space, also my key code, and Adrian was holding a document. He was holding a pen. And he signed something. He actually sat down at my desk, in my chair, and he signed something with my company's stamp sitting on the desk beside him. Helen said, quietly, "Miss Carter, there's also a charge we flagged on the company card this morning. $40,000. Billed to the showroom account." I said nothing. She said, "Miss Carter?" I said, "Can you print that footage log for me?" My voice was calm. My hands were calm. Inside was a different country entirely. But I had spent enough years in rooms full of wealthy, powerful people who were trying to outmaneuver each other to know one thing without question: the moment you show your reaction is the moment you lose your advantage. "I'll need the timestamp files, the charge documentation, and the access log showing who used the back office keypad," I said. "Can you have that ready in 20 minutes? Helen said, "Of course." I walked out of that security office, through the storage corridor, back onto the main floor of my showroom, and I stood for a moment between a white lacquer credenza and a hand-stitched linen sectional that I had personally selected, and I thought with a clarity that felt almost surgical, "They think I don't know." That was the last moment of the old Naomi Carter. If you've ever trusted someone completely and had that trust weaponized against you, subscribe right now. Because what I'm about to tell you is not just my story. It's a blueprint for how people who want what you built will smile at you every single day while they take it apart piece by piece. And it's a blueprint for what you do when you find out. My name is Naomi Carter. I'm 36 years old, And I built my life from an apartment with a broken radiator in the south side of Chicago with nothing but a drafting table, a second-hand laptop, and the absolute refusal to accept that my circumstances were permanent. No inheritance. No connections. No mentor who saw something in me and opened a door. Every door I walked through, I opened myself. Sometimes I knocked. Sometimes I built the door. I studied interior design on a scholarship I almost didn't get, working 2 jobs to cover what the scholarship didn't. I graduated and took the first job I could get, junior assistant at a mid-size residential firm that paid me barely enough to cover rent and treated my ideas like suggestions from a child. I stayed 2 years. I learned everything they'd let me learn. And then I left and I started Naomi Carter Interiors with one client, a small hotel renovation in the West Loop that my professor had referred to me as a favor, half expecting me to stumble through it. I didn't stumble. I delivered the job 11 days ahead of schedule, 14% under budget, and the hotel owner, a stern, exacting man named Douglas Ferris who did not give compliments freely, referred me to 3 other clients within a month. By year 3, I had a team of 8 and a client list that included a tech executive, 2 luxury residential developers, and a boutique hospitality group expanding across the Midwest. By year 5, I had 18 employees, an office on the 14th floor of a building in the West Loop, a reputation that was starting to travel beyond Chicago, and a company valued, conservatively, at just under $4 million. I also had Adrian. I met Adrian Kessler at a charity auction in Lincoln Park. He was charming the way that certain men are charming, not aggressively, not performatively, but with this quiet confidence, this sense of ease, like the room had arranged itself around him specifically. He was tall, well-dressed without trying too hard, and when he spoke to me, he actually listened. He asked questions about my work that weren't surface level. He seemed genuinely curious. We dated for 8 months before he suggested moving in together. We were engaged 14 months after that. He came from finance. Corporate consulting, he said, restructuring companies, optimizing operations. When he started taking an interest in mine, I thought it was love. He'd sit with me on Sunday evenings while I went through project schedules and he'd ask questions, offer perspectives, suggest efficiencies. He had a good mind for numbers. He could see structural patterns quickly. I thought he was just being supportive. I thought it was love, showing up as partnership. And Lila Chen, I found Lila through a design competition 3 years into building the firm. She was 24, fresh, with a portfolio that was raw but genuinely talented. She had an eye for spatial tension, for the kind of bold minimalism that high-end clients wanted before they knew they wanted it. I hired her. I mentored her. I brought her into rooms she hadn't earned yet because I believed in accelerating talent when you find it, because nobody had done that for me and I knew how much it cost. Within 2 years, I made her a partner. Not just in title. In equity. In the actual fabric of what I'd built. Because I trusted her. Because I thought she understood what I'd sacrificed to create this, and that she respected it the way you respect something you've seen built from the ground up. I was wrong about her too. If you've ever looked back at a moment and thought, I handed them everything they needed to hurt me, drop a comment right now. Because that's exactly what I did. And I need you to understand how it happened so you can see it when it's happening to you. Looking back, the red flags were there. They were subtle, the kind of subtle that only looks obvious in retrospect, when you're sitting in a security office watching surveillance footage with your hands folded in your lap and your face completely still. Adrian had started taking on more of the financial side of the business about 18 months before everything collapsed. Not because I asked him to, I had a CFO, a woman named Patricia who was meticulous and reliable. But Adrian would occasionally review reports, offer suggestions, and at some point, I can't even tell you exactly when it happened because it was so gradual, He had shifted from offering suggestions to being CC'd on financial correspondence to having his own login to the accounting software. Patricia left 11 months before the showroom. She said it was a better opportunity. She was professional about it. I hired a replacement, a man named Garrett who came highly recommended. What I didn't know then, what I would find out later, was that Garrett had been Adrian's recommendation. That Adrian had mentioned him to me so casually, in such a passing way, that I had no memory of it coming from him specifically when Garrett's resume arrived through what I thought was a routine HR channel. Lila, meanwhile, had started changing about a year before the showroom. Small things. She was spending more. Her apartment changed, new furniture, she started wearing different things, talked about a trip to Milan in a way that made me think she'd already booked it rather than hoping to go. I noticed and I filed it away without naming it because she was a partner now, because I thought maybe she had savings I didn't know about, because the work was still good and I didn't want to project. Adrian and Lila didn't know each other well. That was what I thought. They'd met at company events. They were pleasant to each other in that professional, surface-level way. I had no framework for them as anything other than two separate people in my life who occupied separate rooms of it. I had no framework for the possibility that the two people I trusted most had built a room together that I didn't know about. 3 days before the showroom, I had been going through our vendor payment schedule, something I rarely did anymore since Adrian had streamlined the approval process, and I found a line item that didn't make sense. A vendor called Meridian Supply Solutions. A payment of $16,000. Approved 2 months earlier. I didn't recognize the vendor name. That wasn't necessarily alarming on its own, we worked with dozens of suppliers, but something about the way it was entered, the category it was filed under, made me pull the invoice. And the invoice was vague. Consulting services. No detail. No project code. No name attached. I pulled 3 more months of records. I found 4 more payments to vendors I didn't recognize. Ranging from $8,000 to $22,000. All filed under general operational expenses. All vague. All approved through the streamlined system Adrian had helped design. I didn't say anything. Not to Adrian. Not to Lila. Not to Garrett. I called a forensic accountant named Sandra Okafor, who had been referred to me by a lawyer friend as someone you call when you think something is wrong but you don't want anyone to know you think something is wrong. I told Sandra I needed a quiet, internal review. I gave her remote access to our financial records. I told her to tell no one. That was 5 days before the showroom. 2 days later, I walked into the security office and watched the surveillance footage. And that night, I sat alone in my apartment. Adrian was at a late dinner with a client, or so he told me, and I looked at the ring on my left hand for a very long time. Then I took it off. I put it in the drawer of my bedside table. I put it under a book. And I thought, if they want to play a game, I will finish it. Stay with me. Because this is where I stopped being a victim and started being a threat. Adrian came home at 11:15. I was in bed, reading. I had put the ring back on. I had thought about it, about whether to wear it or not, and I had decided that the ring was armor right now. The ring was cover. The ring was the thing that said I don't know what you're doing, I'm not watching, everything is normal. He kissed my forehead. He said the dinner had run long. He said the client had been difficult. I said, poor baby. And I smiled. He showered, he got into bed, he was asleep within 15 minutes. I lay next to him in the dark and I breathed and I thought about every document he had ever touched, every password he had ever asked for, every access point I had handed him with both hands, and I thought, not anymore. The next morning, before he woke up, I transferred the contents of our joint business account, a reserve fund we maintained for operational contingencies, into an account that was mine alone. I was careful about the amount. not all of it. Enough. Enough to matter. Enough to give me a position of strength without triggering immediate alarm. Then I called my attorney. Her name is Diana Rossi. She's one of the most expensive lawyers in Chicago. I'd used her for contract work before and I'd never needed her for anything personal, but I knew, when I walked into her office that morning, when I sat across from her and said, "I think my fiancé and my business partner are defrauding my company," that I needed someone who didn't flinch. Diana did not flinch. She said, "Tell me everything." I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it sounds in a person who bills by the hour. And when I was finished, she leaned back in her chair and she said, "What's your priority? The company, the relationship, or the prosecution?" I said, "The company. Everything else follows from that." She said, "Good. Then here's what we do." Diana and I spent the next 4 hours building what she called a legal fortress. We restructured the company's ownership into a protected holding structure, layered in a way that would take anyone trying to claim a stake months of legal maneuvering to even identify, let alone challenge. We moved key contracts and assets into this structure. We locked down the company's financial authorization, quietly, through administrative channels, in ways that looked like routine compliance updates. And Diana said something that I have thought about many times since: let the fraudulent deal continue. Don't stop it. Because a stopped deal is hard to prosecute. A completed one, or an attempted one, captured with evidence, gives us everything. I said, "You want me to let them think they're winning?" She said, "I want you to let them run the play out to where we can see the whole board." I said, "I can do that. Like this video right now if you've ever had to sit across from someone who was betraying you and smile. Because what I'm about to tell you about the next 3 weeks is going to make you want to scream." The industry event was 2 weeks later. The Chicago Luxury Interiors Collective Annual Spring Showcase, an evening event at a downtown hotel. Clients, designers, press, the people who either had money or decided where money went in this industry. I had been planning to attend with Adrian. We always attended these things together. He liked the events, he moved well in them, knew how to work a room. I used to think that was an asset. I used to think his comfort in these spaces was a reflection of his support for what I'd built. I walked in with Adrian on one arm and a calm on my face that I had built deliberately, brick by brick, over the previous 2 weeks. Lila was already there. She was wearing a dress I recognized. I had seen it in a boutique in the Gold Coast 6 weeks earlier, when we'd been at a vendor meeting nearby. I'd pointed it out, laughing, and said, "That's beautiful, it's also $4,000, which is why I'm going to walk away from it." And she'd laughed with me and said, "Same." She was wearing it now. I smiled at her across the room and she smiled back, and there was nothing in her smile that acknowledged any of it. Not the vendor payments. Not the showroom footage. Not the $40,000 charge. Not whatever document Adrian had signed at my desk with my company's stamp. She was good. I'll give her that. She was very good. Adrian got us drinks and fell into conversation with a developer we'd worked with twice. I watched him, the ease of him, the way he laughed at exactly the right moments, the way he made everyone feel like they had his complete attention, and I thought about the first time I'd fallen for that ease. The charity auction. The questions that seemed so genuine. I thought about how good actors always believe in their performance. I wondered if Adrian believed in his. Lila came over to me about 20 minutes in. She said, "You look incredible." I said, "Thank you, so do you." Love the dress. A tiny thing. Almost nothing. But I watched her eyes and I saw it, a flicker, so fast, quickly suppressed. A micro flinch. She didn't know if I knew. Good. I wanted her not knowing. She talked to me about a client meeting coming up the following week, about a project we had in preliminary stages for a residential developer in Lincoln Park. She was professional, detailed, engaged. She was playing her role with precision. I played mine back. Later in the evening, Adrian came to find me and we stood together at the edge of the room and he put his arm around me and said, "Good night. You're working the room perfectly." I said, "I learned from the best." He squeezed my shoulder and smiled, and I smiled back, and somewhere in the elegant ruin of that moment I thought, you have no idea who I've become in the last 2 weeks. Sandra, my forensic accountant, called me on a Tuesday morning, and her voice had that quality, that careful, controlled quality, that professionals use when what they're about to tell you is bad enough to warrant management. She said, "Naomi, I need you to sit down." I said, "I'm already sitting." She said, "The vendor payments you've flagged, they're shell companies. All of them. I've traced 4 of them to a single registered agent in Delaware. The payments are being funneled out in a pattern that suggests this has been going on for at least 14 months. I said, "What's the total?" She said, "Approximately $380,000 over 14 months. The room was quiet. I was in Diana's office, and Diana was sitting across from me, and she heard Sandra's voice through the phone and her expression did not change, but she picked up her pen. I said, "There's more. Tell me the rest." Sandra said, "There's a loan application. Filed 8 weeks ago. For $750,000, secured against the company's assets. Signed in your name." I said, "I didn't sign any loan application." Sandra said, "I know. The signature is a forgery. A skilled forgery, it would pass a casual review, but I've had a document specialist look at it, and it's not your signature." I said, "And the loan has been approved?" Sandra said, "Not yet. It's in the final stage of approval. If it goes through, the funds would transfer to an account I haven't been able to fully trace yet, but it's not a company account." I said, "What is it secured against specifically?" Sandra said, "The company's client contracts, the showroom lease, and your West Loop office space." Diana wrote something on her pad and turned it to face me. It said, "This is what they're using to take the company." I looked at Diana and I nodded. I said, "Sandra, do not stop the loan application. Let it continue." Sandra said, "Are you sure?" I said, "I need the paper trail to be complete. I need every step of this documented." Sandra said, "Understood." I hung up and I sat across from Diana and I said, $750,000. Diana said, "Against a forged signature. That's wire fraud, bank fraud, and forgery at minimum. Depending on what the PI finds, we may be looking at conspiracy charges as well." I said, "I want to know everything. I want to know what they plan to do when they have it." Diana said, "Then let's give them a little more rope. Comment right now, at this point in the story, what would you have done? Because I know what most people would have done. Most people would have confronted them. Most people would have made the phone call, sent the text, walked in and demanded answers. Tell me honestly, what would you have done? I had hired a private investigator 2 weeks earlier. His name is Marcus Webb, former Chicago PD, quiet, methodical, the kind of man who could stand in a crowded room and be invisible. I gave him names. Adrian Kessler. Lila Chen. I told him I needed communications, meetings, any documented contact between them outside of the obvious professional context. Marcus came back to me with recordings. Not illegal recordings. Illinois is a 2-party consent state, and Marcus was careful and thorough. What he had was recordings from a context where consent had been established through the business surveillance I had authorized on my own premises, including the showroom, which I technically still controlled, and what he had from other sources was reconstructed through legally obtained records, emails accessed through the company server, which I had every right to access, calendar entries, phone records pulled through civil subpoena that Diana had quietly arranged. And then there were the recordings that Lila had made herself, on her own phone, in her own space, that she had shared with Adrian through an encrypted messaging app, and that Marcus had accessed through means I will not detail specifically, but Diana had reviewed and confirmed were within a legal framework I didn't need to worry about. The recordings were, I don't have a better word for it, clarifying. In one of them, Lila is talking and she says, she's so oblivious. She literally thanked me yesterday for managing the vendor relationships. She thanked me. Adrian laughs. He actually laughs. And he says, she trusts you completely. That's her whole problem. She trusts too fast and she doesn't check the math. Lila says, we need the loan to clear before the showcase. If we have the funds in place, we can have the Chicago office transferred over by the end of the quarter. Adrian says, the Delaware LLC is clean. Once the transfer goes through, there's nothing traceable back to us. Lila says, and if she figures it out? Adrian says, and I have listened to this exact moment probably 40 times, and every time it lands the same way. Adrian says, by the time she figures it out, we'll have everything we need to contest the ownership structure. Garrett's already positioned. We'll have majority operational control. She can fight it in court for 5 years. We'll be in New York by then. Lila says, New York. Adrian says, the firm there is already interested. We bring them the Chicago client list, the contracts, the reputation she built, and we walk in as founders. Lila says, using her reputation. Adrian says, she built a good brand. We're just going to use it better. I sat with those words for a long time. She built a good brand. We're just going to use it better. Not you're brilliant, Naomi. Not you deserve this, Naomi. Not even we earned this together. She built a good brand. Like I was a stepping stone. Like I was infrastructure. I thought about the drafting table and my South Side apartment. I thought about the 2 jobs and the scholarship and Douglas Ferris's referrals and the 18 employees and the $4 million valuation that I had built from nothing, from pure stubborn will and talent and sacrifice, and I thought, you will not use it better. You will not use it at all. If you respect the kind of quiet you hold when everything inside you is screaming, subscribe to this channel. Because what I did next is the reason this story has an ending worth telling. Diana and I had a meeting with a corporate attorney named James Park, who specialized in asset protection structures. Together, the 3 of us, Diana, James, and Sandra, built something that I can only describe as a trap disguised as a fortress. On the surface, the company appeared unchanged. Operationally, day to day, everything looked the same. Adrian had his access. Lila had her partner status. Garrett was still sending reports that appeared routine. But underneath, the architecture had shifted completely. The core assets, the client contracts, the intellectual property, the signature design processes I'd developed over 8 years, had been moved into a separate holding entity that was registered in my name alone through a blind trust. The showroom lease had been restructured under a subsidiary that was also protected. And the loan, the fraudulent $750,000 loan, we let it complete its journey through approval. We let it get to the point of funding. And then James filed an injunction, quiet, clean, the kind that doesn't generate press, that froze the receiving account on the basis of fraud, supported by Sandra's forensic documentation, the forged signature analysis, and the surveillance footage from the showroom. The money never moved. Adrian and Lila didn't know any of this had happened. As far as they could see, the loan was in the final stage. As far as they could see, the plan was on track. As far as they could see, they were weeks away from having everything they needed to walk out of my company with my life's work in their hands. And then I announced the showcase. I called it the Naomi Carter Interior Spring Legacy Showcase. I sent invitations to every major client, every investor who had ever shown interest in the firm, every journalist who covered the luxury design space in Chicago, and a selection of people who were significant not because of their professional relationship to me but because of their social position, people whose presence at an event meant the event mattered. I sent the invitation list to Adrian to review. As I always did for events. I wanted him to feel included. I wanted him to feel like everything was normal and the event was just an event. He said, "This is a big room. A lot of people." I said, "I want this one to be significant. I feel like it's a turning point for the company." He said, "You're not wrong. Timing is good." I thought, yes. The timing is very good. I told Lila I wanted her to present a segment of the showcase, a 10-minute presentation on the company's design philosophy and future direction. She was pleased. She accepted with what looked like genuine warmth. She said, "I've been hoping for more visibility at events like this. Thank you for trusting me with this." I said, "I trust you completely, Lila." She smiled. I smiled. We were two very different kinds of smiling. In the days leading up to the showcase, I was calm in a way that I can only describe as geological. Like bedrock. Like something that had been under pressure for so long that it had become its own kind of stone. Adrian was attentive that week. Affectionate. He brought me coffee in the morning the way he used to in the early days, before the interest in my business had gradually become something else. He asked how I was feeling about the event. He said he was proud of me. I said, "Thank you." I thought, 36 hours. Marcus had prepared the footage package. Sandra had prepared the financial documentation, clean, organized, chronological, annotated so that anyone without a financial background could follow it clearly. Diana had briefed a colleague at the firm who had experience in real-time legal intervention, someone who would be present at the showcase, in the room, unremarkably, dressed like a guest, available to initiate formal service of documents at a specific moment that Diana and I had choreographed to the minute. I went to the venue the night before the showcase to walk through the setup alone. The event team had done extraordinary work. The space was beautiful, the way only a space designed by someone who actually understands beauty can be. I stood in the center of it and I looked at the screens we'd had installed, large format, positioned for maximum visibility, and I thought about Adrian in my showroom. About Lila laughing. About the voice recording, "She built a good brand, we're just going to use it better." I thought about the woman who had sat at a drafting table on the south side and believed, with everything she had, that the work was worth it. I said, out loud, to the empty room, it was worth it. Then I went home and I slept 8 hours. The night of the showcase. The room filled the way good rooms do, gradually and then all at once. By 7:30, there were 120 people in the space. Clients I'd known for years. New contacts. Press. 3 people from a private equity group that had expressed interest in investing in a potential expansion. The developer from Lincoln Park. 2 people from a national design publication. And Adrian. And Lila. Adrian was in a dark suit, and he was working the room the way he always worked rooms, and from across the space I watched him and I thought, this is the last room you will ever work with my name attached to it. Lila was doing her preparation, reviewing her presentation notes, chatting with the event coordinator. She looked confident. She looked comfortable. She looked like a woman who believed the next chapter of her story was about to begin. She was right about that. At 8 o'clock, the event coordinator signaled for the formal program to begin. The room settled. I walked to the front. I have spoken publicly dozens of times, pitch presentations, client unveilings, industry panels. I am not someone who is afraid of a room. But this particular walk to the front of this particular room was the longest walk I have taken in my professional life. Not from nerves. From the weight of what I was carrying and the precision required to deliver it without flinching. I stood at the podium and I looked at the room and I said, "Thank you all for being here tonight. This event is called the Spring Legacy Showcase, and I chose that name deliberately. Because tonight is about legacy. It's about what we build. It's about who builds it with us. And it's about the truth of what lasts." I paused. The room was attentive. Polite, expectant applause. I said, 8 years ago, I started this company with one client, one contract, and no safety net. And I want to tell you tonight, in front of everyone who has mattered to this firm, everyone who has trusted us with their homes and their investments and their visions, what it actually took to get here. I could see Adrian in the third row. He was smiling. He looked proud. He looked like a man who had no idea that anything was about to happen that wasn't part of a lovely promotional evening. I said, building something real requires two things that most people underestimate. It requires sustained effort. And it requires absolute integrity. Because what you build is only as strong as the foundation it stands on. And the moment the foundation is compromised, the moment the people you trust betray that trust, everything built on top of it is in danger. The room shifted slightly. A few people exchanged glances. Nothing dramatic. Just the small recalibration of a room sensing that a speech has moved in a direction it wasn't expecting. I said, "Tonight, I need to show you something." I nodded to the AV coordinator. The screens activated. And I watched the room watch my life's betrayal unfold in high-definition clarity. The showroom footage was first. Adrian and Lila. The document signing. The charge notification. The timestamp. Clean, clear, undeniable. I heard someone say, "Is that," and then stop. I heard someone else make a sound, just a sound, a sharp intake of breath, from the far left of the room. I said, over the footage, "What you're watching is my fiancé and my business partner, in my showroom, accessing my company's financial authorization to sign documents on my behalf without my knowledge." The room was very, very quiet. I said, "The charge you see on the document is $40,000. Billed to my company's account. For services that do not exist." The footage changed. Sandra's forensic documentation, simplified, annotated, clear. The shell companies. The payments. The 14-month timeline. $380,000. I heard Adrian say, from the third row, "Naomi." I said, without looking at him, "Please don't." Just those two words. Quiet and absolute. He stopped. I said, over the course of 14 months, these two individuals routed approximately $380,000 from my company through fraudulent vendor accounts. Additionally, a loan application for $750,000 was filed in my name, against my company's assets, using a forged signature. Now there were murmurs. Now the room was alive with the contained energy of people absorbing information they cannot entirely process in real time. The screen changed again. The audio recording began to play. "She built a good brand. We're just going to use it better." You could hear the exact moment the room understood completely. It was not loud. It was the opposite, a sudden, collective silence that was denser than noise. And then someone near the back, I don't know who, said, quietly, "Oh my God." Lila said, from somewhere behind me, "This is taken out of context." I turned and looked at her. Just looked. She stopped talking. I said, "The full recording is 18 minutes long. The context is consistent throughout." I turned back to the room. I said, "I'm sharing this tonight because the people in this room deserve to know who has been operating under the name of this company. Because your trust matters. Because the work we do together matters. And because I will not allow what was done in the dark to continue to operate in the light." Diana's colleague moved. Two of Marcus's contacts, quiet, in the back of the room, unobtrusive until this exact moment, moved. Adrian stood up. He said, Naomi, this is not, you need to hear my side of. I said, your side has been documented extensively. Diana? Diana, who was seated in the second row, stood, turned, and said, with the absolute economy of a person who has done this before, Mr. Kessler, I'm going to need you to sit down. You are being served with civil fraud documentation right now, and anything you say in this room is being recorded. Adrian went white. Not figuratively. His face changed color in a way I had never seen a human face change color. The performative ease, the charm, the practiced comfort, it dropped like a mask that had lost its adhesive. And underneath it was something I had never seen on Adrian Kessler's face before. Fear. Lila had stood up too. She was looking around the room, at the guests, at the screens, at Marcus's people by the door, and she said, I want to, I need to call my attorney. Someone near me said to someone else, this is insane. Someone else said, she planned all of this. The developer from Lincoln Park caught my eye and he nodded. Just once. A small, serious nod. I said, to the room, I'm sorry that this is what tonight became. It was not the showcase I intended to present. But it is the truth. And I believe this community deserves the truth. I stepped back from the podium. The room broke into conversation, overlapping, chaotic, the particular chaos of 120 people all trying to process the same extraordinary thing simultaneously. Marcus's contacts had positioned themselves at the exits. Diana and James were moving toward Adrian. One of the event staff, who had been briefed, was quietly directing the press contingent toward a designated area where Diana would provide a formal statement later. Adrian tried to reach me. He actually crossed the room toward me, and his face had shifted now from fear to something that I can only describe as desperation. He said, Naomi, please. Let me explain. This is not what it looks like. I can explain the recordings, I can. I said, Adrian. He stopped. I said, we are done. We have been done for a long time, and I think on some level you knew that. I think on some level you knew I would find out eventually, and this whole plan was designed to make sure you had everything you needed before I did. He said, Naomi. I said, Diana is going to walk you through the legal situation now. I would suggest you listen to her very carefully. I turned away from him. I walked to the far side of the room, to the window that looked out over Michigan Avenue, and I stood there for a moment. The street was alive below, cars, people, the ordinary hum of a city at night. I thought about nothing specific. I just breathed. A hand touched my arm and I turned. It was Patricia. My former CFO. The one who had left 11 months earlier, the one I now understood had likely left because Adrian had made her position untenable in ways I hadn't recognized. She said, I didn't know how bad it was. I should have told you more when I left. I said, you're here now. She said, I saw the invitation and I thought I owed it to you. I said, thank you for coming. She said, what do you need? I said, honestly? I need a very good cup of coffee and about 48 hours. She laughed. A surprised, genuine laugh. And I laughed too, and it was the first real laugh I had had in over 3 weeks. The aftermath happened the way aftermath always does, in phases, each one less dramatic than the climax but somehow heavier, because the drama of a single night is nothing compared to the slow, grinding machinery of consequence. Adrian was formally charged within 2 weeks. The charges were extensive: wire fraud, bank fraud, forgery, conspiracy. His attorney entered the usual preliminary posturing, the usual suggestions that things could be resolved quietly, The usual implication that a woman who had just publicly dismantled her own engagement at an industry event might be emotionally compromised and therefore not a credible witness to her own financial records. Diana responded with 340 pages of forensic documentation and 2 expert witnesses. That conversation ended. Lila was charged separately. Her arrangement was somewhat different. She had been less operationally involved in the financial fraud, more the second actor in a scheme Adrian had designed, but involvement is involvement, and the recordings were not kind to nuance. She ultimately reached a settlement that included full financial restitution and restrictions on her operating in the design industry in Illinois. Garrett, the accountant, quietly resigned and consented to cooperation in exchange for reduced exposure. He provided 3 additional months of documentation that filled in gaps we hadn't been able to reconstruct independently. The loan was formally voided. The injunction held. Not a dollar of that $750,000 moved anywhere except back to the bank that had nearly approved it. What happened to me? What happened to Naomi Carter Interiors? I brought Patricia back. I asked her if she'd come back as CFO and she said yes before I finished the sentence. I promoted 2 of my senior designers who had been quietly loyal through everything and didn't entirely understand what had been happening but had stayed steady regardless. I thanked them properly, with titles and equity and the kind of conversation that says I see you and I will not forget this. The press coverage was significant. There is, it turns out, a particular kind of story that the design world finds fascinating. A woman who built a firm from nothing, was systematically betrayed by the people closest to her, and then dismantled the betrayal at a public showcase with the precision of a surgeon. Multiple outlets ran it. A national business publication did a longer piece on the financial aspects of internal fraud and used my case as the anchor. The phone rang more than it had ever rung before. Some calls were from people I'd never done business with, who had seen the coverage and wanted to work with me. Some were from other business owners, mostly women, who said some version of "this happened to me" or "I think this is happening to me," and asked if I knew a lawyer or a forensic accountant. I gave them Diana's number and Sandra's number without hesitation. Some calls were from people in the industry who simply wanted to say, "We knew who you were before this, and we know who you are now." 6 months after the showcase, I signed a contract to expand into New York. Not because Adrian had suggested it. Not because his plan had informed mine in any way I intended. But because New York was the logical next step, and the difference was that when I signed that contract I signed it on my own terms, with my own structure, with my own name on the documents, with my own verified signature. I stood in an office in Midtown on the day of signing and I thought about a recording and a sentence. She built a good brand, we're just going to use it better, and I thought, I am using it. And I am using it better. Just not the way anyone expected. Subscribe to this channel. I'm not asking as a formality. I'm asking because if this story meant something to you, if you heard yourself in any part of it, if you recognized something, if you've been sitting in a life that felt slightly wrong in ways you couldn't name, then you need to hear what comes next. And there is always a next. Always a deeper layer. Always another story worth telling. I want to tell you what I actually learned. Not the practical lessons, those are obvious in retrospect. Audit your finances. Don't give access without oversight. Verify. Document. Know your vendors. Know your people. The real lessons are harder to articulate. I learned that trust, when it is real, is one of the most powerful things one human being can extend to another. And because it is powerful, it can be weaponized. The fact that it was used against me does not mean I should not have extended it. It means I should have extended it more carefully. It means that trust, like anything of value, requires maintenance and verification, not because the people you trust are inherently suspect, but because you owe it to yourself and to the thing you've built to confirm that what you believe is true is actually true. I learned that silence is not passivity. Silence, chosen, strategic, controlled silence, is one of the most powerful tools available to a person who knows what they're facing and has decided how to face it. The moment I chose not to confront Adrian in my apartment that first night was not a moment of weakness. It was the moment I chose the outcome over the emotion. It was the moment I became more dangerous than they had accounted for. I learned that the people who take from you are often people who have convinced themselves they deserve what they're taking. Adrian genuinely believed, I think this is true, as uncomfortable as it is, that my success was partially his because of how much he had inserted himself into it. That the work I had done was elevated by his presence. That his contribution, though fraudulent and corrosive, had generated something he had a right to. That kind of belief is perhaps the most insidious form of entitlement, because it allows someone to act criminally while telling themselves a story about justice. I learned that what they couldn't take, what was never actually at risk, was the thing that made all of it possible in the first place. Not the money. Not the contracts. Not the client list. The capacity. The skill. The eye. The discipline. The woman who sat at a drafting table in a cold apartment and decided, without anyone's permission, that she was going to build something real. That was never available for them to steal. And I learned, and this one is the one I want to leave with you, because I think it's the one that travels furthest beyond my specific story into something universal. I learned that removing someone from your life who has betrayed you, even when that someone is someone you loved, is not a loss. It is a restoration. It is the return of something that had been borrowed without permission, your energy, your trust, your future, and it hurts the way a wound being cleaned hurts. Not because the cleaning is wrong. Because you finally understand the depth of the wound. Adrian is an illegal process that will take years to resolve. I don't think about him very often anymore. When I do, it's not with anger. It's with something more like clarity. The way you feel when a fog lifts and you see the actual terrain. He was in my life, and now he isn't, and my life is not diminished by his absence. My life is precisely what it should have been all along. They thought they were taking everything from me. All they did was show me who never deserved access to my life. And I made sure, with documentation, with Diana, with Sandra, with Marcus, with a room full of 120 witnesses, with screens and recordings and forensic reports and 8 years of work that no forged signature could touch, I made sure they never got it again. Like this video if you stayed until the end. Comment below with one word for what you feel right now, because I want to know. And subscribe, because there are more stories where this came from. Stories about choosing yourself. Stories about the silence before the strategy. Stories about what happens when someone underestimates exactly the wrong person.